let me introduce the speaker. Good evening. Today's speaker is Professor Ved V. Datar. He's Assistant Professor in the Department of Mathematics, IISc Bangalore. And his areas of research includes geometric analysis, complex differential geometry. Professor Ved V. Datar received PhD from Rochester, the State University of New Jersey in 2018, and Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Computer Science from CMI, Chennai Mathematical Institute. And he received very prestigious Infosys Young Investigator Award. And Professor Ved V. Datar has written very reputed papers in highly reputed international journals such as Advances in Mathematics, Bulletin of London Mathematical Society, Mathematical Research Letters, Geometric and Functional Analysis, Journal of Differential Geometry, and the Journal of Symbolic Geometry. With such a brief introduction, I request Professor Ved V. Datar to start his lectures.
I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity and this very kind introduction. So I'm going to be giving 4 lectures in this series. I thought, let me just, yeah.
I think voice is not reaching.
Hello?
Is it the same for the participants? Your voice is not fully reaching. Yeah, screen is shared. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
All right, so let me begin. So let me first give a brief outline of the 4 lectures. So in today's lecture, I'm going to talk mostly about holomorphicity. So I'm going to define what it means for a function to be holomorphic. And we'll see, hopefully, plenty of nice examples. In the second lecture, which is right after this one, I'm going to talk about a very broad class of examples, the power series. And in some sense, we shall see this in much more precise form later. In some sense, power series are all the examples of holomorphic functions, right? So, and then there is this accompanying notion of analyticity. I'll also say a few words about that. In the third lecture, we are going to have some fun. I'm going to go back to take a step back and just focus on this class of examples, namely exponential function, trigonometric functions, and the logarithm function. So things that we take for granted in high school, but their actual home of these functions basically lies on the complex plane, right? So their actual home lies in complex analysis. And we'll also see as sort of an offshoot of defining exponential functions, trigonometric functions, we'll actually define this famous constant pi, right? So of course, we are all familiar with pi. We come across that in high school, etc. From a modern perspective, the right way to define the constant pi is basically through complex analysis. So we'll say a few words about that in the third lecture, and in the fourth lecture, I'll Cauchy. Okay, and then if time permits, I'll also talk about harmonic functions. Okay, so that's the outline. That's the broad sort of overview of what we are going to talk about. So I guess Saurav must have talked about. He must have talked about the topology of the complex plane and so on. But since this is sort of the first lecture on actual complex analysis, I thought at the beginning it might be useful to just give you a bird's eye view of what makes complex analysis so special, right? So just some overview of complex analysis before we begin.
Professor Ved,
Yeah.
I think some of the participants are unable to hear full voice. So is it possible to set the mic? So this is always the problem.
Sure. So let
when
me
we are
try
using a
one thing.
tab.
Let me just try the following.
So
Just
what
give me
we
a
can
sec.
do, yeah.
Excuse me, sir. You can go without mics, headphones, sir. Without headphone is also clearly audible.
So
is this better? Or?
Yeah, it is better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So
there may be some echo problem comes. Therefore, in the main system, you can turn off the audio.
Yeah. So I basically switched off. I turned off the audio on one of my devices. So is this fine now?
Yeah, it's fine now. Very nice.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. So of course the starting point. So the starting point, as in all analysis or calculus courses, is to basically talk about functions on some domain. And so here the domain will, of course, always, I mean, I'm not going to say this again and again, but will always mean an open subset of the complex plane. So of course, we know what complex numbers are. They're basically the real numbers where you sort of adjoin this one extra number. So this is the collection of all x plus iy. Generally, we'll denote complex numbers by z, where x and y are real numbers. Right? And I basically satisfies, of course, this famous equation, I squared is -1. Right? Now, the set of complex numbers is actually almost like the set R2, right? In what ways? In a couple of ways. So firstly, I mean, what is R2? R2 is just the set of pairs of real numbers, right? So the complex plane is precisely like R2 as a real vector space. So I'm sure Saurav must have talked about addition of complex numbers, scaling a complex number by a real number, and so on. So that makes C into a real vector space, a two-dimensional real vector space, and it's precisely the same as the vector space R2. And another way in which it is exactly like R2 is a topological space, right? So what that basically means is that if you want to talk about convergence of complex numbers, you just have to look at the real part of that complex number and the imaginary part of that complex number. And convergence is basically the same as convergence of the real parts and convergence of the complex parts. So our notation here is going to be that the real part of x plus iy is, of course, equal to x, and the imaginary part of x plus iy is equal to y, right? So the set of complex numbers is exactly like R2 when it comes to treating it as a real vector space and also as a topological space. But there is a key difference, and that is what leads to all the beautiful phenomenon in complex analysis. So the key difference is one can divide. So actually, I should say one can multiply and divide complex numbers. Right, so those of you who have some experience with algebra, they would, of course, recognize this as the statement that C is actually an algebraic field, right? So the fact that you can actually divide by complex numbers is what makes complex analysis so special, and not just the same as calculus in R2, right? Okay, so now let me tell you what it means for a function to be differentiable. I'll come back to this again in about 15 minutes, but let me just give the definition, since I guess many of you might already be familiar with it. So given a function defined on an open subset of C, we say that f is complex differentiable, and I'll basically label it as C differentiable. Maybe at some point z in omega, if the following limit exists. So you've already seen what it means for complex functions to have limits. So we say that our function is complex differentiable if this limit exists. So the definition is formally exactly the same as our favorite calculus definition, right, of differentiability. But the crucial thing here is that this h, by which you are dividing the difference, is allowed to be a complex number, right? And that is what I meant when I said that the fact that you can divide complex numbers is what makes this special. Okay, so the key point here is that h is a complex number, and you actually call the limit, you'll denote it by f prime of z, and then of course we say that f prime is the derivative of, or if I want to be super pedantic, I should say complex derivative of f at this point z. Okay, so that's the definition. Now before we look at examples or look at some properties of these complex differentiable functions, I just want to draw a sort of quick comparison with this notion of real differentiability from, this must be a familiar notion from multivariable calculus. Okay, and then in the fourth lecture, we'll come back to this in much more detail, right? But think of this as sort of a trailer just to whet your appetite so that you have something to look forward to in this course, right? So why should, I mean, why do many people consider complex analysis as sort of one of the most beautiful parts of classical mathematics? It's because of the table that I'm going to draw. Okay, so again, let f be as before. I'm going to draw this table to sort of compare complex differentiability and real differentiability. So now you can also think of this subset omega, which is a subset of the complex plane, but the complex plane, at least as a topological space, is the same as R2. So you can think of this as also a function from R2 to R2. And let's assume that it's R differentiable. Okay, so what, I mean, how do you, what are some of the nice things that happen on the complex differentiable side, which do not necessarily happen on the real differentiable side? Okay, so the first nice property is what is called as analyticity, and hopefully I'll have time in the second lecture today to define that. But roughly speaking, that basically means that a complex differentiable function has a Taylor series expansion at every point. Okay, so that is roughly what is meant by, maybe I should color this differently. Okay, but unfortunately, this is not true in the case of real differentiable functions, right? And this is sort of the most famous example. You can take f of x to be e to the minus 1 by absolute value of x squared if x is not equal to 0. So it's a piecewise defined function, and 0 if x is equal to 0. Okay, so so why is this not analytic? That's because all partials of f, if you evaluate those partials at x equal to 0, all the partials will basically just be 0. So all the derivatives at the point 0 will always be 0. This is a very nice exercise if you haven't seen something like this. And I guess you have tutorial sessions. So if you don't have much stuff to talk about in the tutorial sessions, maybe you can try to prove this fact that all partial derivatives of f are always 0 at the point x equal to 0. But so I mean, if all partials are 0 in particular, it means that the Taylor series is identically 0, but f is not identically 0, right? So the Taylor series cannot converge to our function in this case. Okay. So all right. So analyticity is certainly not true for an arbitrary differentiable function in the real category, right? Okay, the second property, which is very nice, is sort of related to this, which is called as analytic continuation. Okay, so what this means, or at least one version of this means, is that suppose you take some open subset of omega, right? And suppose f restricted to this open set is identically 0, then this actually implies that on the entire open set, f is identically 0, right? So if you were to draw a picture, let's say this is my complex plane and this is my omega. Suppose there is a very tiny open neighborhood here, which I'll call U, on which f is 0, then that forces it to be 0 everywhere else, right? Remember, we are assuming that f is complex differentiable. Okay. But of course, this is no longer true in the real category. And in fact, in the real category, you have these so-called bump functions, right? So you can construct even smooth functions that look like this. So the graph looks like this. Okay, so they're basically 0 on a large open set, but they might have a bump somewhere. They might not be 0 everywhere, right? And of course, to construct this, you basically use this function that I wrote above to construct these bump functions. And in fact, if you have studied a bit of geometry, you have this very nice object called as partitions of unity, and they're actually constructed just by using these bump functions, right? So part of the difficulty in the subject that I work with is that you don't have these bump functions. So if you want to do geometry over the complex plane, you have to use slightly better techniques because you don't have these bump functions. Okay. All right. The third property that that you have is basically good convergence properties. Okay, so so what do I mean by that? So for instance, if fn's are complex differentiable on omega, and let's say fn converges to f uniformly. So I hope you remember uniform convergence. If not, maybe later today I'll just remind you of the definition of uniform convergence. If fn's converge uniformly, then this automatically implies that f is also complex differentiable. So the limit, as soon as you know that along the sequence you have complex differentiability and you have uniform convergence, the limit also automatically has complex differentiability, right? And in fact, we also get the convergence of the derivatives. Okay, and of course, this is not true in the real category. So for instance, you can take this family of, this very standard example. You take this family of functions, then you know that they converge uniformly to the absolute value of x function. But we know that this guy is not differentiable. Whereas these guys are actually smooth. They're infinitely differentiable. Okay, so you do have uniform convergence, but the limit is no longer differentiable, right? So in fact, it's kind of funny that in in a typical undergrad course, you first learn real analysis. And the one thing that sort of is drilled into your brain in a real analysis course is that you should always be careful. You should not take limits unless you're sure that there is good convergence properties, right? So, or if you have two limits, you should not interchange two limits and so on. So in a real analysis course, you're always asked to be very careful about everything that you do. But then the next semester you take a complex analysis course, and again life is very beautiful because very beautiful and very easy, because all these nice properties actually now hold in the complex category, right? So the fourth and the last property that I'll talk about, I'll sort of tell you about is the so-called Liouville property. And all of this during the entire course of these lectures, you will see proofs of all of these properties. Okay, so I'm not going to do all of that. Somebody else will do it, but you'll certainly see the proofs of these things, right? So so this is just like a sort of trailer with a lot of spoilers, right? So the point here is that suppose you have a holomorphic or a C differentiable function defined on the entire complex plane, okay? And suppose it's bounded. Then this automatically forces f to be a constant. That's quite remarkable, right? So you cannot have
Suman, lecture got struck. Are you able to see the lecture now?
Yeah, but it is stopped.
Okay, can you share Veddathar's phone number immediately?
He has not yet. I have.
I think Professor Veddathar has disconnected. Just wait for a few minutes. All of you, please wait for a few minutes.
Yeah, sorry, I lost my internet connection. Am I again audible or?
Yeah, yeah, you are audible. You are
Yeah,
audible now.
yeah. Sorry, this might happen intermittently because when it
Yeah, yeah.
rains in our locality, the network somehow is unstable. Sorry.
No issue. This is a common problem.
Right, right. Okay, let me start sharing. So maybe it's a good time to see if there are any questions. Okay, if not, maybe I'll just continue.
Sir,
Yeah,
sir, in the beginning you write f from r square to r square.
that's
In the
right.
right side.
Yeah, here, right? Yeah.
But we take real valued function.
Yeah, yeah. So you could. That's right. So I'm cheating a bit, but you could sort of take the function that. I mean, a real valued function is also a function into R2, right? Because it just happens that the second component is 0. So for instance, you can take the function x going to f of x comma 0, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's but yeah, you're right. I said functions to R2, but real valued functions are also special cases of that, right?
Okay, sir.
Okay, any other questions or? Okay, so maybe let me say a few words about the techniques involved. So the techniques involved are first power series methods.
Please repeat the fourth point, sir. Fourth point.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the fourth point was the Liouville property. So what this says is that if you have a complex differentiable function that is differentiable on the entire complex plane and it's bounded, then it has to be a constant. Okay, and I mean, this is quite remarkable if you think about it, right? So, and one of the very nice consequences of this is the fundamental theorem of, sorry, not calculus, I should say fundamental theorem of, fundamental theorem of algebra, okay? And in fact, it turns out that this is not true in the real category because, again, you can just take the bump function that I drew here. This is, of course, clearly a bounded function. It's a smooth function and it's non-constant, right? So clearly the Liouville property cannot hold for real differentiable functions. Right, so some of the techniques involved include power series. So this was, if I know my history correct, this was mainly due to Weierstrass, and he exploited power series methods a lot. The second technique basically come from PDEs, partial differential equations, and these are precisely the Cauchy-Riemann equations, right? So both these will be covered in, I mean, I guess in lectures 2 and 4. But then there are more techniques available. There are also geometric techniques, and this was, I guess, developed most due to Riemann. And you can exploit geometric techniques because it turns out that complex differentiable maps are also conformal maps, which means that they preserve angles between tangent vectors. Okay. So that gives you a very nice sort of geometric picture of complex differentiable maps. And then, of course, the main technique comes from integral methods. Okay, and this is basically via the Cauchy integral formula. Okay, and this again, Cauchy integral formula is again a remarkable formula, and it's the first sort of instance of a technique which is there throughout geometry and topology, which is namely localization techniques. And as far as I know, this was one of the first sort of localization formula. So what do localization principles tell you? They basically tell you that sort of a global integral, in this case, it will be basically a line integral over some curve, is determined by the function value at a single point, right? Starting from Cauchy integral formula, this sort of technique is now very popular in almost all of geometry and topology. All right, so now let me start with the real content of these lectures. So let me go back to let me define what holomorphic functions are. Okay. So let me formally give a definition of complex differentiable functions. I've already done it, but there's no harm in repeating. So from now on, omega will always be an open subset of the complex plane. So you say that a function f from omega to c is C differentiable or complex differentiable, or sometimes I'll be lazy and just say differentiable. Okay, because this is a course on complex analysis, so any mention of differentiability is basically just complex differentiability, right? So we say that this is complex differentiable at a point z if the following limit exists. Right, if this limit exists, and then we actually call this limit the complex derivative of f at z. So we then say that the limit is the complex derivative, or simply the derivative of f at the point z. Okay. And sometimes it's actually useful to have a slightly different formula. So this is also the same as the limit as zeta approaches z of f of zeta minus f of z by zeta minus z, right? And this guy here is sometimes called the difference quotient. Right, the name is very suggestive because you're taking the difference of the function values and then taking the quotient with zeta minus z, right? Okay. Also, sometimes you denote this by df by dz, right? So that's also another notation that is popular. Okay, so now we basically say that f is holomorphic on this set omega if it is complex differentiable at each point. Okay, so if it's complex differentiable at every point of the domain, we call it a holomorphic function, and our notation will basically be O of omega. So by definition, this is the set of holomorphic functions from omega to c. Okay, so that will be our notation. All right, so any questions till now?
Small doubts are written in the chat box.
Yeah. So while discussing functional analysis, sometimes we take the domain as open and connected, and sometimes just open. Right. So that's a good point. I'll basically right now take my domain to only be open. I don't want to put restrictions of connectedness, but many of our important theorems actually will require connectedness. So I'll get to that in, when necessary, right? But right now, I just don't want to arbitrarily put this restriction in, but we'll soon, you're absolutely right, we'll soon require omega to also be connected, okay? But right now, just take it to be an open set.
Professor Ved.
Yeah.
I want to add some points that there is the difference between real case and complex case. The fundamental theorem of integral calculus may not be true, no longer true in the complex case.
There is a version that is true. So what do you mean by it won't be true? Or
actually, in a real case, when f is continuous in an open set, then it must have a primitive. But it is no longer true in the complex case.
No, what? Sorry. Okay.
So in real case,
right,
if f is continuous on an open set in R, then it admits the primitive, admits a primitive. But it is no longer true in the complex case.
That's,
with continuity, it must.
That's true. That's true.
That's
that's true.
And it is also true, I think, that over a compact set, Weierstrass approximation theorem is true for real case, but it is no longer true in the complex case.
Right, but there is also a version of Weierstrass. There is a version that also works for complex analysis. But you're right that
if you take the circle and suppose there is a continuous function like 1 by z, okay.
Right.
And 0 is omitted from the complex plane. So suppose Weierstrass approximation does hold. So therefore, there is some polynomial approximating that function. But over this circle, the polynomial is 0. Integration of polynomial is 0. But 1 by z is still not 0.
That's true. But on the other hand, so that's why I think this restriction of complex differentiability is the crucial one. Right. So in any of the, the examples that you gave, you do not have, you just have continuity. If you're looking at only continuous functions, then, it's sort of, you can treat continuous functions on C on the same level as continuous functions in R2. Right. On the other hand, if you put this restriction of complex differentiability, that makes all the difference.
And also in this case, you just mentioned that keeping differentiability in our mind, that in complex case, if a function is once differentiable in an open set, it is infinitely times differentiable, but it is no longer true.
Right, but that's even, analyticity, I'll define it in a moment, is actually even stronger than that, right? So in fact, analytic functions, even in the real category, analytic functions are always infinitely differentiable. So, so when I say that these holomorphic functions are going to be analytic, that actually is a much stronger statement, right?
Here the speaker is trying to say that how the analyticity is more beautiful. So that's what he is saying, that but not other way around.
Right, it's much stronger. Yeah,
we are enjoying Professor Ved.
Oh, thanks.
Nice.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so let me now continue. So let me, I guess Sudeep just now mentioned this thing about complex differentiable functions being infinitely differentiable. So that's sort of a regularity property, that you start with something, some notion, and then you try to prove that your function has some other nicer property, right? So as a very sort of weak beginning, let me state this proposition, which also is true in one variable calculus, for instance. So there is not much special about this proposition, but just for completeness, let me at least state it. So if f is complex differentiable at any point z in omega, then this actually implies that f is automatically continuous at the point z. Okay. And the proof, let me just quickly give you the proof because it's not very difficult. The proof is quite simple because what does continuity mean? So So f continuous at z if and only if the limit as h goes to 0 of f of z plus h minus f of z is 0, right? But now to calculate this limit, I'll do the following trick. So let me multiply and divide by h, right? So then by the product rule for limits, this is the same as the limit. I mean, if it exists, this is the same as the limit of this times the limit as h goes to 0 of h, right? But then this guy, we are assuming, remember, we are assuming that f is complex differentiable. So by definition, this limit actually exists and is in fact equal to the complex derivative at the point z. On the other hand, what is this limit? This is precisely 0. So when you multiply, you just get 0, right? So that means that if you assume complex differentiability, you get continuity for free, which is of course what also happens in one variable calculus, right? Let me also state some other properties, which I'm going to state without proof, because I mean the proofs are exactly similar to what we have in one variable calculus. And I guess I'll also, I mean, they can be found in most standard textbooks. So let's assume we have two functions from omega to c, and suppose both are differentiable at this point z, and let also, I mean, let's take two complex numbers. Okay. So then the following properties are true. So if f is constant in a neighborhood of z, this automatically implies that f prime of z is 0. Okay. And that is not very difficult to imagine, because the point is that this, if you look at the difference quotient, the numerator will then identically be equal to 0, right? If zeta is close enough to z, then the numerator will identically be equal to 0. So the limit in particular will also be 0. Okay, so this is not very difficult to prove. Then the derivative, an important property is that the derivative is also has some linearity, which means that if you look at a linear combination af plus b times g, then this is also complex differentiable at the point z. And in fact, you have the following rule in calculating the derivative. So if you calculate the derivative at z, then that will just be a times the derivative of f at z plus b times the derivative of g at z. Okay. So of course, a special case of this linearity rule is the sum rule and the difference rule. So for the sum rule, you can take a and b both to be 1. For the difference rule, you can take a to be 1 and b to be minus 1 or something, right? And then similarly, you also have our favorite product rule from one variable calculus. So if you take the product f times g, that's a new function that is also differentiable at z. And again, you have a formula to calculate the derivative. So if you compute the derivative, that's basically going to be g of z times f prime of z plus f of z times g prime of z. Okay, so this is of course the so-called product rule or the Leibniz rule. And then finally, you also have the quotient rule. So this says that suppose g of z is not equal to 0, then f by g, you can take the quotient and this turns out to be also complex differentiable at z. And again, you have a formula to calculate the derivative. This is the so-called quotient rule. So you take g squared, and then you have g times f prime of z minus f times g prime of z, right? So all of this is exactly like in one variable calculus, and you also have another nice property, which is namely the chain rule. So what this tells you is that suppose f is another function defined in a neighborhood of f of z. So let me maybe illustrate this with a picture. Let's say you have this as omega, and let's say f is this function, mapping it onto another another set, let's say f of omega, and let's say this is some z, and suppose you have a small possibly a smaller neighborhood here of f of z. So sorry, I should say this is z, and let's say this is f of z. And let's say there is another function h which is defined on this small neighborhood to the complex plane, which is also, let's say this is also C differentiable. Okay. So then the conclusion is that if you compose these functions, which means you basically first apply f and then apply h. So that's usually written by h composed with f. Then this is also differentiable at z, and you have a nice formula to calculate the derivative. The formula is that the derivative at z is precisely given by h prime at f of z times f prime at z. Okay. All right. So these are basic properties. I'll leave the proof as a sort of reading exercise. This is very very standard. Okay. So unfortunately, because this is such a, I mean, we have so many new things to cover, it might not be possible to give you all the proofs. But wherever there is something special about the complex differentiable case, I'll try to give you all the details. Okay. All right. So now let's look at examples. Okay, so the first sort of simplest example is that of simplest non-trivial example is that of monomials. Okay, so that means I'm assuming that my function f of z is basically equal to z to the n, where n is some integer. Sorry, not a natural number necessarily, some integer. Okay, so z, I guess you all must be familiar with the notation. Z usually refers to integers, right? Okay, so let me talk about some special cases. So suppose n is equal to 0, right? So in this case, your function f of z is identically equal to 1, right? And we just now saw that if you have a function that is constant, then that will imply that the derivative is always 0, right? So this is rather almost trivial case where you take n equal to 0, you get a constant function, the derivative is 0, right? So now suppose n is a natural number. Okay, so what that means is that I'm assuming that n is positive. Okay, so let's try to understand whether this function is differentiable at all, and if it is differentiable, can we calculate the derivative? Right. So it's two problems. Firstly, you have to show that the limit exists, and then you have to actually calculate the limit. Okay, so here's the goal. So the goal is to understand if the limit as zeta goes to z of this exists. And remember, I'm assuming that n is now a natural number. I'll come back to the negative case soon. Okay. So I guess you must all be familiar with this trick. There's this very nice formula for factoring zeta to the n minus z to the n. So it's basically given by zeta minus z times zeta to the n minus 1 plus zeta to the n minus 2 times z, etc. up to zeta times z to the n minus 2 plus z to the n minus 1, right? So sometimes this is basically called the geometric series formula. Okay, so I mean geometric series formula for a finitely many terms. And how do you prove this? You just I mean sometimes it's best to just do a brute force calculation. So you just multiply the two terms in the bracket and see that a lot of things cancel out, and you only end up with this term and this term, right? So I guess you should never be shy of just sitting down and computing, right? So then, what is our difference quotient? So this implies that that the difference quotient is precisely given by this finite sum. Okay, so maybe I'll write down just for convenience. I'll write down one more term. Okay, now what do I need to do? I need to analyze as to what happens if you let zeta converge to z. If zeta converges to z, you see that this guy converges to z to the n minus 1. Similarly, this term converges to z to the n minus 2. But then you also have an additional copy of z. They'll multiply to give you z to the n minus 1 and so on. So you notice that every term actually converges to z to the n minus 1. How many terms are there? There are basically n terms, right? Because the power of z basically increases from 0 to n minus 1. The number of integers from 0 to n minus 1 is n. So this is going to converge to n copies of z to the n minus 1. Okay, so not only does the limit exist, we have actually calculated what the value is. So this implies that d by dz of z to the n, which remember is the same as the derivative of z to the n, is precisely n times z to the n minus 1, as long as n is a natural number. And now, in fact, if you take n to be 0, you see that the formula still works, right? Because you would have that the derivative is 0 everywhere. Okay, so in fact, this works for all n natural number, including 0, right? So the union of all natural numbers with 0. Okay, so now that leaves out this other case. Suppose n is negative. What do you do? So if n is negative, that implies that n can be written as minus m for some natural number m, right? And then z to the n is basically just, I mean, this is almost like a definition. This is, I mean, because we are taking n to be minus m, z to the n is z to the minus m, which is precisely 1 by z to the n, right? Now, of course, you see that when z is equal to 0, this is not well defined, right? So as soon as we take negative exponents, we have to restrict our attention to points that are away from the origin, right? So, so more precisely, we can apply quotient rule. So, I mean, this is basically a function. You can think of this as the quotient of two functions, we have already seen that z to the m is a complex differentiable function. So the quotient rule tells you that as long as the denominator does not vanish, you have complex differentiability. So quotient rule implies that whenever z is not equal to 0, 1 by z to the m is complex differentiable. And it also gives you a formula to compute the derivative. So what is the derivative? Is z to the 2m. Then you have z to the m times the derivative of 1 minus 1 times the derivative of z to the m. But the derivative of 1, I mean 1 is a constant function, so the derivative is 0, of course. So this term cancels out. So what you're left with is basically minus 1 times the derivative of z to the m. M is a positive integer. We have just calculated the derivative of z raised to a positive integer, that's given by this. So this derivative is going to be m times z to the m minus 1, and then you have z to the 2m. So if you do your algebra carefully, you will basically get minus m times z to the minus of m plus 1, right? Or you can write this as this. Okay, but now you remember that n was equal to minus m. Okay, so you replace this minus m by n, and you replace this minus m by m, you get back the same formula that you had before. So what this tells you is that so if n is a positive integer, then this is precisely this. And if n is a negative integer, so I'll denote it by minus the natural numbers, then you have the same formula, except you have to now assume that z is not equal to 0. Okay, so that basically tells you everything that you need to know about the differentiability of these monomial functions. Okay, so now let's take a step further. Let's talk about polynomials and rational functions. Okay, so a polynomial is basically a function of the following form. P of z is an z to the n plus an minus 1 z to the n minus 1, etc., all the way up to a1 z plus a naught. Right, and we typically, I mean, n is going to be a natural number, and we assume that an is not equal to 0. So what this implies is that the degree of the polynomial is precisely n. Right, so the degree in general is the power of the highest or the highest power of a non-zero coefficient. Right, so our convention is whenever we write a polynomial of this sort, we'll always assume that an is non-zero. So we're writing the first sort of highest exponent term. Okay, so then the linearity property will tell us, because I mean, we have already seen that all of these monomials are complex differentiable functions on all of C, right? So linearity will tell you that P of z is C differentiable on all of C. Okay, so by the way, here's a small definition. Such functions have a name because they form a very useful class of functions. So we say that a function f is entire if f is holomorphic everywhere. Right, so again, to remind you of the notation, it's good if you get used to this notation, but just to remind you, this means that f is C differentiable at all points. So what we have just seen is that polynomials are basically entire functions, okay? And we'll see examples of other entire functions either sometime in the second lecture today or certainly in the third lecture. Okay, and what is the derivative? Linearity also tells you how to compute derivatives. So the derivative is precisely given by term differentiation. So if you differentiate z to the n, you get n times z to the n minus 1. So the derivative here is going to be n times an times z to the n minus 1. The second term will give you this. You get to this term, the derivative of z is of course 1 everywhere. And then you come to the constant term, and again, of course, the derivative of constant terms is 0. So you notice that when you differentiate a polynomial, you basically lose out the constant term. It will get cancelled, right? And a nice way of writing this is, of course, using the summation symbol. So this is k going from 1 to n of k times ak times z to the k minus 1. Okay, that's the derivative of a polynomial function. Okay, so now what is a rational function? So a rational function is basically a function of the form something that's a quotient of two polynomials. Okay, so both P and Q are polynomials. Okay, so now, I mean, right away you notice that there's a problem because you're dividing by a polynomial, and polynomials, of course, might have zeros. And of course, they, by the fundamental theorem of algebra, they do have zeros, plenty of them. So if you're dividing by something that might be 0, there might be a problem. So this function is not defined everywhere. It's only defined at places where q is not 0. So also, whenever you write a rational function, there is always a convention that you assume that the GCD of P and Q is 1, which is equivalent to saying that P and Q have no common factors. Okay, so it's always a convention when you write a rational function to write it as a quotient where the two polynomials, numerator and denominator, are in some sense in their lowest possible form. So you've already cancelled out all the common factors, right? So now suppose Q has roots or zeros, which are denoted by, let's say, alpha 1 up to alpha s. Then the quotient rule implies that R is basically C differentiable at all points away from these zeros. Okay. And of course, the quotient rule also tells you how to calculate the derivative of R. So I don't want to write down the formula, but you can try to do it on your own. But the key point is that it actually defines a complex differentiable function everywhere except at the points where the denominator is 0. Okay, so that is as far as polynomials and rational functions are concerned. These are some of the nicest complex differentiable functions you can lay your hands at. But of course, whenever you have a definition, you always want counterexamples, right? So something that does not satisfy the condition in the definition. So here's a function. So consider f of z to be z bar. So you're taking the complex conjugate, right? And now my sort of claim is that f is not C differentiable anywhere. Okay, right. So let's prove this. So let Z be some complex number. So to decide whether something is differentiable or not, you have to take the difference quotient, right? So in this case, the difference quotient it's precisely this. So what is this going to be? This is equal to Z plus H conjugate minus Z conjugate divided by H. But conjugate is again a linear, it's a conjugate linear, or at least an R linear operator. So you can write this as Z bar plus H bar minus Z bar, which is H bar by H. And now you see that if you take H going to 0, this limit does not exist. Why is that? Because suppose H is a real number, right? I mean, you're taking H going to 0 where H is some arbitrary complex number, right? So the idea is that suppose you first approach 0 along the real axis and then you approach 0 along the imaginary axis. And you'll see that if the limit exists, they both should give you the same answer, right? But you'll see that you'll get different answers. Why? Because if H is real, then this difference quotient is identically equal to 1. Okay. On the other hand, if H is purely imaginary, so then I can, for instance, write H as Ik, where K is some real number. So what is H bar by H? That's basically Ik bar by Ik. And now when you take I bar, you basically get minus I. Right? So that's going to be this. So along the imaginary axis, this is going to be identically -1. So there's no way that the limit exists. Okay. So that proves the claim that this function is actually not complex differentiable. Okay, let me give you another example. So let's say, I don't know, what was, this is the fourth example. So let's take f of z, the magnitude of z, right? So remember in the sort of plane representation of complex numbers, the distance from the origin is mod z. Now my claim is that this is not holomorphic. Okay, so let's see an argument for this. So this is a standard trick, but in calculations, it's always more convenient to deal with mod z squared rather than mod z. Okay, so I'm going to argue by contradiction. So suppose f is C differentiable. So actually not even holomorphic. This is actually not C differentiable at any point. Okay, so suppose f is C differentiable at some z, right? So let's, for the time being, let's assume that z is not equal to 0. I'll leave the case when z is equal to 0 as an exercise. So suppose this is differentiable, then by the product rule, this implies that f square is also C differentiable. Okay. But then let's again write down the difference quotient of f squared. So that is f squared at z plus h minus f squared at z divided by h. So what is this? This is mod z plus h squared minus mod z squared by h. Which again, if you calculate, this will turn out to be this. Okay, so what am I using? I'm basically using the fact that mod z squared is z times z bar. Okay, that's all that I'm using. And then you simplify this, you get what I've written. So let's divide by h. So you get zh bar by h plus z bar plus this. And now again, try to understand what happens when h goes to 0. So when h goes to 0, if you look at the last two terms, this guy, you can check. I mean, again, you can write this as h bar by h, which is the same as h bar. So when h goes to 0, h bar also goes to 0. So this third term goes to 0, and the second term is sort of a constant in h. So this combination converges to z bar. On the other hand, by what we have just seen, this limit does not exist. So in particular, our original limit that we were worried about does not exist. Okay, so this implies that okay, you can try the same. I mean, you can try to work. So as an exercise, I'll leave the case of what happens when z equal to 0, right? You can try to work this out. So then this is a contradiction. So this implies that mod z is not C differentiable. Okay. All right. So I guess any questions on this, or I still have about 15 minutes in this session. If there are no questions, maybe I'll just review some basics about convergence of series and so on. So any questions?
Sir, hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, differentiation of z to the power n when n is irrational number. In that case, how we will prove that?
Right, but that's a good point. But what is the definition of z to the n when n is an irrational number? Right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's a good point. But I will say a few words about this in the third lecture. So remark, I don't like to use n for a non-integer number. So let me use the letter alpha. So if alpha is irrational, actually forget irrational. Even if it's a rational number, it's not quite clear, right? So suppose not an integer, let's say, then it is not clear what the definition of z to the alpha is. And in fact, this is very closely related to branches of logarithms, right? So once we, I guess Saurav already said a few things about the geometry.
This was discussed just now in the previous class.
Oh, even square roots, is it? Or
yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So then
power of a complex number he has discussed.
Right. So but it's still a challenge to prove that the power of a complex number, even if you select a branch, why is that holomorphic? Okay. And I guess, I mean, one can sit down and try to calculate this limit, but that's not the ideal way of doing it. The ideal way of doing this is once you introduce integration theory, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to prove that the branch that Saurav introduced is holomorphic everywhere that he has defined it to be after you do the branch cut, but I will sort of give a power series expansion of that in the third lecture, so that at least in some region you know that that function is complex differentiable. And then once that function is complex differentiable, you basically define z to the alpha as exponential of alpha times log of z. Okay, so the point is that I still haven't defined this. I still haven't defined this in a holomorphic sense, right? So once I do that, we'll have a definition for powers of complex numbers where the exponents are allowed to now be not only irrational numbers, but complex numbers. And then the derivative can be computed using chain rule. But all of that, I think, makes sense only once we introduce the exponential function, once we introduce the logarithm function as a holomorphic function, and then we'll learn how to calculate the derivative of this. So I want to put that off until the third lecture. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So if not, yeah. So
sir,
go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, what is the meaning of the derivative of a complex function in the geometric sense?
Right. So right. So in some sense, the right. So essentially, I mean, let me draw a picture. Suppose you have an open set F, and you have an open set omega, and you have this complex function which maps it to some region f of omega in C. So what this does is the following. So suppose you fix a point P and you have the corresponding image f of P. Now suppose you take two curves, right? So let's say gamma 1 is a curve passing through P, gamma 2 is another curve, and these curves are, let's say, smooth, so you have tangent vectors. Okay, so what the complex derivative essentially is so f dash basically measures, I mean, you have seen the polar representation, right? So any f dash can be written as the absolute value of f dash and e raised to I times the argument of f dash, right? So geometrically, this basically measures the scaling of f, and this part basically measures the rotation of f. Okay, but of course all of this is only up to the first order, because I mean, remember, even in calculus, the first derivative basically tells you only, I mean, gives you only a linear approximation, right? It gives you a first order approximation. So to first order, what is the geometric meaning of the complex derivative? The absolute value of the complex derivative will basically give you a scaling. So that means if you look at these tangent vectors, if you look at the image, that is going to, I mean, of course, the curves are, the image of the curves is going to be something like this. Then up to first order, the derivative is going to tell you how much the tangent vectors are scaled. That is going to be told by the absolute value of the derivative. And similarly, let's say, I should draw this correctly. So let's say you have another, I mean, this is, let's say, the image of gamma 1. This is, let's say, the image of gamma 2. The argument of f prime basically tells you how much this is rotated up to first order. Okay, so for instance, this conformality that I was saying is basically the fact that because the angle is only getting rotated by complex differentiable functions, what the conformality tells you is that this angle remains unchanged. So the tangent vectors might get scaled, but the angle remains unchanged. Okay, so was that a good enough explanation? So in particular, yeah.
Yes, the conformality, it says.
Yeah. So hopefully Vamsi is, I guess, going to talk about conformality.
Yeah.
And there's also an exercise in the tutorial problems that I've submitted. There is an exercise problem on proving the fact that holomorphic functions are actually conformal. And I first asked you to do it for some simple function like f of z equals z squared, where you can explicitly write everything down and check that you have the angle preserving property. And then you can also try to generalize that to all holomorphic functions. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so should I, I have 8 minutes, should I stop now, or should I do a small review of convergence of infinite series?
It would be fine if you give a small review on convergence of.
Okay, so have they seen convergence of complex numbers at all, or?
Not. Just we are introduced to only argument, principal argument, and the logarithmics.
I see. So
branch cut, branch point we have discussed.
I see. So let me just give you some brief review of convergence, okay? And then maybe I'll stop. So let me take 5 more minutes. So review of convergence of complex numbers and functions. A bad straight line. Okay. So so here's a definition. So suppose Zn is a sequence of complex numbers. Okay, so then we say that Zn converges to some other complex number p if the following happens. So if for all epsilon positive there exists a capital N such that whenever, if you go far along enough in the sequence, they'll start getting closer and closer to this point P. Okay. So, just to draw a picture, let's say this is your point P and this is your sequence of points. Right, but eventually, let's say they start getting closer and closer to your point. So, of course, I can't draw an infinite number of points. So, let's say they sort of keep getting closer and closer to P. So, what this definition means is that no matter what epsilon disk you draw, so let's say you draw an epsilon disk. So by definition, this is the set of all complex numbers such that the distance from P is less than epsilon. So notice that this is strictly less than epsilon. Whenever I talk about disks, they'll always be open disks. Okay. Then eventually all Zn's will basically lie inside this disk. Okay. So eventually, no matter how small of a disk you draw, eventually all points are going to be contained in that, right? So that's the definition of convergence of a sequence of points. Okay, so then one can take this further and talk about convergence of series. So we say that an infinite series so that's generally denoted by an. In this set of lectures, my indices n will always run from 0 to infinity. Okay. So then I say that this series is convergent. And let's say convergent to S. And how do you write this? You write this as the sum. So this number is called the sum of this infinite series. If the sequence of partial sums So what is the an nth partial sum? That's basically the sum of ak as k goes from 0 to n. So basically add up the first n number of terms, or rather in this case, the first n plus 1 number of terms. And that, of course, you know how to do, right? You know how to add up a finite number of complex numbers. So you say that the entire series converges to this sum S if the sequence of partial sums Sn's converge to S. Okay. So an equivalent, I mean, if you unravel the definition, an equivalent way of saying this is that for all epsilon, there exists a capital N such that for all n bigger than capital N, if you look at the difference between Sn and S, but what is the difference between Sn and S? That is precisely the difference between S and the sum of the first n plus 1 terms is less than epsilon. Okay, so then you say that the infinite series converges. Okay, and the crucial point here is through this proposition, the so-called Cauchy criteria. So this says that summation an converges if and only if, notice that the arrow is going in both directions. So if and only if the sequence of partial sums is a Cauchy sequence. Okay, so what does that mean? Let me remind you, that means for all epsilon positive, there exists a capital N, again an integer, such that whenever you have n bigger than m bigger than capital N, if you take the difference Sn minus Sm, which again, if you write down the definition of the partial sums, that will basically be the sum going from m to n of these terms ak, that ought to be less than epsilon. So that means if you have if you have an infinite series that looks like a0 plus a1 plus a2, etc., at some point you'll hit the term am plus 1, etc., up to an, and then this keeps going, right? So then you're saying that if you go beyond a certain point, if you sum up an arbitrary number of terms, that sum is going to be less than epsilon in magnitude. Okay, so that is what Cauchy, being a Cauchy sequence means. And then this Cauchy criteria says that to check convergence, you just need to check whether your sequence or your series is Cauchy or not. Okay, and why is this useful? Because in the definition of convergence, it's important to know what the sum is, right? I mean, that's part of the definition. So it's important to know what the sum is. The advantage of the Cauchy condition is that you don't need to actually know what S is. Okay, so that's the advantage of the Cauchy criteria. So I guess I've run out of time, so maybe I'll continue this forward in the first take this forward in the first 15 minutes of the next lecture before we get down to power series. Okay.
So we'll take half an hour break.
Sure.
Thank you. Very nice.
Yeah.
Talk.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
So let us have a coffee break and we will meet at 6 o'clock.
Sure. I can keep this signed in, right?
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
Yeah. No issue.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.